So let's start by looking at this picture of Salvator Mundi. You might have heard there's some controversy. Has anyone heard of the controversy surrounding this portrait or this painting? Okay, good. So, someone says no. All right, yeah. So there's some controversy surrounding the provenance or the origin, the authorship of this painting, with many people disputing whether or not this painting is by Da Vinci. So during the class today, we might have a chance to look at some of Da Vinci's work and consider whether or not we might think this is Da Vinci or not. So, art controversy aside, we're going to look at Da Vinci's work, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Da Vinci. He's very well known, and rightly so, especially because I think he's someone who was skilled at many different endeavors, maybe to his fault, because I think he got a little too involved in one project and would jump to the next and jump to the next, and often didn't finish his work, which is true for his paintings as well. So let's just go ahead. And I want to focus on one side of Da Vinci, which is kind of related to what I just said, which is this kind of humanism. And you have to think of humanism as it relates to the Renaissance. And I think the best way to think of humanism is to celebrate humanity, celebrate human thought, human invention, human innovation, and to treat humanity as something that an ideal. And I think that's a good that contrasts with attitudes towards being human that veered towards self-hatred, and I'm thinking more in terms of like Christian ideas about self-loathing, original sin, the idea that anything earthly is lower than anything in heaven, which is higher. So in the Renaissance, there's a kind of recalibration that takes place, including the idea that humanity is not necessarily this dirty, vile, base-like thing that's sort of doomed to go to hell and doomed to sort of indulge our own worst instincts, but rather maybe to be human is something noble and good, of course, depending on how you cultivate your own humanity. So you have to look at this era in the wake of the Black Death, in the wake of the church losing a lot of its authority, and that wasteland, kind of like after a fire, after a big fire breaks out, you have a kind of wasteland, and out of those ashes will rise a new crop of plants that are a lot more hardy and a lot more capable of perhaps withstanding a wildfire, and or a new kind of variety of biology emerges in the wake of a wildfire. So that metaphor, I think, is an apt one for describing the effects of the Black Death, and how in the aftermath of the Black Death in 1348, you have a carte blanche, a kind of a tabula rasa, a blank slate from which a lot of new things can happen. And so a lot of the Renaissance can be explained in terms of that, the possibilities that come out after the Black Death. So just keep that in mind. We're still in an era that's reacting and or adjusting to the world as it emerges after the Black Death in 1348. So some big dates apart from 1348 is also 1453. That's the fall of Constantinople, when Christianity loses basically one half of its kind of dominion over the world, and it loses it to Islam, and sends a shudder throughout Christianity. So that's another thing to think about. So, but with Da Vinci, I think he's more someone who benefits from the possibilities, especially scientific interest in science and interest in discovery in the wake of the Black Death, particularly because the Black Death triggered a kind of panic about the limits of our knowledge in understanding how to deal with something like the Black Death, because they had no ability to develop vaccines or science the way we have today. Remember, we came up with a vaccine very quickly after COVID. At least, we have the ability with science to do things that they couldn't do back in this era. And so Da Vinci, I think, is one of the early examples of an artist slash scientist slash engineer. And we'll get back to this painting in a moment, and I'll put the kind of controversy about it into some context. So remember, we saw a lot of pictures with artists exploring and pushing the range of bringing pictures to life on a flat surface so they feel like they have depth. Here's an early Da Vinci that we saw, like I think last week, and it shows a lot of promise. His ability with color is really exquisite, and I think his talents were recognized from an early age, and that allowed him to rise in the ranks. And so, he's not someone born with nobility or richness, but because of his talents, he's rewarded. And I think, again, that's another example of changes that took place after the Black Death, where it's not like there's a rigid hierarchy anymore, but rather there's some room for people to advance that might not have otherwise advanced prior to the Black Death. And I think Da Vinci really benefited from having his talent and having the ability to nourish those talents with patrons who discover his abilities. And I think from then on, he's really kind of a celebrated figure. Not quite as celebrated as Michelangelo, who was definitely the celebrity of his day, but there was a lot of competition between the two, and I think it was a positive competition that pushed them both to be all the better. So this is a very early painting in Da Vinci's career. I think he was around 20. And yeah, it's pretty impressive. I would think we spent enough time talking about it. So let's see how his work relates to something like this as we move forward. His precursor was, of course, Botticelli, or at least they overlap a little bit. And I think there was some competition between the two of them, but they have a little different style. I think the way I see it, Da Vinci's more subtle, whereas I think Botticelli's a little more bombastic or a little more stylized, more colorful. I personally tend to be more like, I like bright colors, and whereas I think Da Vinci's more subtle and more kind of takes more time, and just maybe more. I don't want to say like they're one better or worse, but there's had different personalities when it comes to painting. Yeah, I think here you see the subtlety in Da Vinci, and notice the real use of light and dark. And we'll see that in a lot of artists moving forward. It's called chiaro oscuro, chiaro oscuro, which is light and black, dark and light, clear and dark combined. So he's playing with this idea of dark colors receding as well as having bright colors pop out. And that's really a discovery that they make, I think, in the wake of someone like, remember, we saw Botticelli. His work tended to be, or at least some of his work tended to fit into that middle range of colors where nothing really pops. So I think that the discovery they're making in this era is that, wow, you can paint in such a way that makes the subjects pop out almost like they're literally popping out of the canvas. And there's almost a holy light, like a sacred light shining on them, that also, I think, enhances the spiritual quality of the pictures. And it's also a chance for you to think about, well, how many of these artists are really expressing their faith through painting? And that's a really powerful thing whenever you have an artist who has a kind of a metaphysical or spiritual calling. They're guided by that, and it bleeds into their artwork and nourishes their artwork. And so a lot of these artists, even though there's a kind of momentum towards more secular interest in secular, like science and engineering, they still have one foot firmly in Christianity, or at least in their religion. And I think that's always really neat when you have people who can kind of reconcile and happily move forward with both sort of hemispheres, science and art and religion, without feeling any sense of struggle or contradiction with them. So it's a really an interesting, exciting time, I think, for the world of art, because these artists are drawing from many sources that up until this point really weren't available to them due to taboo or other reasons. And that includes things like anatomy and dissecting bodies and understanding the body from the inside out. And you might notice this is the Virgin of the Rock. So there's the Virgin Mary. I don't think this is actually from a scene from the Bible, but I think more a way of just recasting the Virgin Mary in a whole new light. In this case, I think protecting probably like baby Jesus or someone, John the Baptist, the equivalent of that. But the rocky backdrop is really kind of almost surreal, and almost feels like something from like the movie Interstellar, when they're on that rocky ice planet. But yeah, the Virgin Mary here, I think, is meant to be like a protector, and the rocks are shelter. And yeah, I don't want to spend too much time on each of his works, just to give you kind of a survey of some of his works from his life. This is an early painting he did, at least this part of it, as part of the workshop of another guy named Verrocchio. So yeah, this painting itself is by his mentor. And so this is a chance to think about the idea of a workshop and different artists collaborating particularly to work for the master, who then passes on his talents to the next generation. And so it's kind of has one foot in the guild system and another foot in kind of just maybe I don't know what you would call it, like a skills, like training artists. So I don't think today we would necessarily think of artists working in a workshop. Rather, you think of the individual artist going to school and then finding their own voice. But I think early on in the arts, it was still very much like a craft, like a guild. And so you really need to work with a master to learn how to mix the pigments and stretch the canvas and all kinds of other things. One thing I'm wondering about, by the way, in terms of this workshop is maybe during the Black Death, up until the Black Death, there might have been a lot of control over access to colors and medium, and maybe they didn't want just anyone being able to paint. I'm speculating here, as you can tell. But perhaps after the Black Death, there was suddenly like, oh, I can go right to the source of the color kind of thing. So I think there's a lot of room for more research, historical research on how artists were able to benefit from direct access to tools and space and subjects and colors that might not have been so accessible before the Black Death. Someone could, the guy who maybe was in charge of all the color could have died off, and maybe after the Black Death, maybe they could get a direct relationship to the source of the color, which is often either a vegetable dye or minerals that are ground up into colors that are then blended into a medium. So a lot of changes taking place after the Black Death. And in terms of humanism, I think this very famous iconic picture of the Vitruvian Man, remember, based off of a piece of writing in a book by Vitruvius, who was the Roman father, quote unquote, of architecture. Da Vinci scoured the library, saw this piece of writing, and did this drawing in response to that book. So it's a great chance to realize that Da Vinci was really hungry for knowledge, and he found that hunger, he satisfied that hunger by going to libraries and investigating. And this book, many books have been rewritten and handwritten over and over, and so the original was probably long gone. And Da Vinci must have realized there's a lot of treasure to be discovered in these libraries, and had greater access to them than ever, both because perhaps all the sort of intermediaries, that the kind of hierarchy had kind of faded, but also the church is a lot more lenient with its allowing for people to explore things like anatomy and dissections and just science in general. This is all leading to people like Galileo, discovering that the earth revolves around the sun. Yeah, exactly. He was approved to dissect people. So the church, would not let you dissect people unless you had permission, because the church basically stewarded your life from birth to death. You were born in the church, baptized, spend your life going to church, and then there's a plot of ground available to you for your death. And so the idea of a hospital is really not quite what it is today, where we've kind of taken the church and outsourced all of those component parts, all those services, to other institutions that are more secular now. So the church did a lot of, in fact, I would say the closest equivalent to the church now is your smartphone, because it tells you where to go. It tells you that it's like an alarm clock. If you need advice, you go to your phone. So we're all walking around with like this little micro sort of phone, micro church in our pocket that serves a lot of things that the church used to do. Not all of them, obviously, and I wouldn't say that the phone is a religious thing, but as far as just the basic services that are we going to be buried with our smartphone? Maybe one day kids will get a smartphone the day they're born. Uh, Anyhow, so yeah, this picture is a great example of humanism, where you're sort of measuring man according to these absolute perfect ideas about geometry, the circle and the square, the interaction between the circle and the square. Being kind of a constant sort of source of maybe interest in like sacred geometry and idea of perfection, and filtering that idea of perfection through a human body is really a big deal, because that shows that we've recalibrated humanity from being this kind of base creature that's not worthy of, that's not seen as an ideal, and now the human body is really beautiful again. And that goes back to the swinging of the pendulum back towards naturalism. And remember, the last time we had seen that pendulum in peak naturalism mode was, around the time of Caesar Augustus around 0 AD. And now we're about 1400 years later, literally 1400 years later, and the pendulum has slowly swung back towards this interest in naturalism. So for about 1400 years, Christianity was really all about spiritualism, seeing the body as kind of something beast, like low and not heavenly. And now we're back to seeing the body as beautiful and worthy of praise. And Da Vinci is kind of trailblazing that path forward. And as you guys might remember, I've got my own Vitruvian Man that I'm putting up in the Museum of Science and Industry in Tampa this January. So I'll let you guys know about that, and maybe I'll make sure you guys have a chance to go check that out for those who live near Tampa. So yeah, this is a very exciting time to be alive, and I don't think it's the perfect analogy to life after COVID, but I think as you guys get older and you look back on your life, you'll definitely notice it'll come out into more sharp relief how COVID impacted society, civilization, and how it recalibrated a lot of things. And so that's why I kind of wanted to watch that video in class, just so you can collectively absorb that understanding of the Black Death and how it impacted civilization. And I think in the coming decades, people will look back and reflect on how COVID had an impact on the world. And so you might see that artists are going, the art world is still transforming right now. And I think that will continue. And it's not necessarily like a cause and effect from COVID to the art world transforming, but because of just the general changing of a lot of things because of COVID, and of course other things as well. And so, yeah, someone mentioned anatomy. We finally get this view into the body at things that were otherwise a mystery before. People probably just thought, whatever they thought about what goes on inside the body. And I think they had a pretty limited understanding of medicine as a result. I think the four humors was a way to talk about imbalances in the body, bile, melancholy, just a very kind of simplistic way of understanding medicine, and very much filtered through the lack of knowledge as well as a kind of religious taboo. And so that starts changing after the Black Death, because even the church realizes we need to understand things a little better, because no one wants to get sick or see all their friends die or just feel with the uncertainty and the chaos of a kind of devastating natural disaster, which I think is arguably what the Black Death was. It was a natural disaster in the same way you could say COVID is a natural disaster. And people probably had survivor guilt afterwards. They probably thought they were punished for leading a course that needed to be rerouted. So I think a lot of people in this era understood in a deeply subconscious or conscious way that it was okay to embark in a new direction, because God had punished all those people for leading one way, and now it was sort of like an open horizon, and it was okay to explore things that had not been explored before. And so Da Vinci takes a real interest in human beings and subjects in the body as a way to understand anatomy and bring subjects to life in a way that really we haven't seen before until this era. And here's a self-portrait of Da Vinci. It doesn't look like the first picture we saw, Salvator Mundi. So I don't think there's much of a self-portrait going on there. But you notice he is one of the first, maybe not the first, but it definitely embraces this idea of eliminating the background. So why might an artist choose to eliminate the background and instead add this dramatic black backdrop to the subjects? Someone says, okay, great. So there's many, there's often a choice, like artistic choice like this might serve many objectives simultaneously. So including focusing on the subject, that's definitely one of the things that it achieves. You're now eliminating any noise from the background, and there's this almost hyper focus, like a spotlight, almost like a theatrical spotlight on the subject. And that's really a powerful thing, because it is, visually powerful. It feels all like the subject is all the more important than if there was more stuff behind them. Now, you could say, well, it also eliminates some context, but it heightens the mystery, right? So I think Da Vinci is really interesting, because for me, when you remove the religious subject matter, and I think we can agree this is not a religious painting, it beckons a question, or forces a question, well, what is interesting about someone if not their religious calling or their religious status or their religious identity. And here we're looking at a young woman, probably about your age, the age of you guys, like 18, 19, 20. And it's not a religious painting. So this is the first time we get to think, well, what fills the void absent any religious meaning? And I think in this case, that black backdrop contributes a heightened sense of mystery. And I think, where else do we see mystery? Is there anything else that's kind of mysterious? I think your brain has asked the question about this picture. Like, what's the question that this picture kind of raises? And this is where you got to kind of listen to your subconscious mind. Yeah, exactly. Where is she looking? And a lot of you probably already were thinking that, and you were like, maybe that's a, but yes, your brain is always kind of like, this is what's happening. And you just kind of have to, vocalize it. And sometimes it's wrong, but even if you're wrong, then you'll always remember it and you'll always be right, if you know what I mean. So yeah, what's she looking at? Right. So and you might think, well, that's not enough just to sort of wonder what she's looking at. But I would argue, no, that might be something worthy of just a painting, right? A painting about someone with mystery. And I think that black backdrop reinforces the mystery. So you have many layers of mystery. And even the animal, which is an ermine, something that only rich people could afford, is kind of looking the same direction she is. So the artist is really aware that there's a kind of, I don't know, sleight of hand where he's there. She's looking at something, and who is she not looking at? She's not looking at you, right? Not looking at me. She's not looking at us. So we feel a kind of psychological sense of, no attention. We're not getting attention. And so we might feel combined with that mystery, with the feeling like, oh, she's not giving us attention. The two of those create, I think, their own kind of tension, and you want to know, and your brain starts wondering and filling in the void. And I think that's exactly what's going on here. Now, in terms of color, you notice she's got these primary colors, blue, red, and yellow. And that reinforces the sort of, she's in the prime of her life, a young person in their prime. So I think he's, making really neat choices artistically. Here's a question I might ask you guys. How long has she owned that pet? How long is this a pet that she's owned for a long time? And how can you tell? And this goes to maybe our newest formal tool that we haven't talked about, which is like movement. So there's not much movement here, but there is a little bit, including the fingers kind of pushing delicately. In fact, I'd say the hand is one of the most impressive. Yeah, the pet seems comfortable. So the fact that the pet isn't squirming, if it's a new pet, you're going to be holding it like don't run. So it feels like it's not just a prop that the artist gave her to hold, but rather she's got a very what a gentle relationship with the ermine. And so there's a deeper connection between her and the pet than just sort of like a little trophy pet or just a little, arm candy. So they have a connection, and he's also interested in what she's in. So for me, that makes her all the more interesting as a subject. It's not just a pretty person holding up an animal. It's really like, oh, here's someone with a sidekick, right? Someone with a connection to this creature. And her hand is kind of pointing in the direction of the mystery. So I'm just offering some ways to think about meaning in the absence of a kind of religious story that provides the underlying meaning. So we're definitely getting away from the Virgin Mary or Jesus on the cross or the saints or anything religious. And you have to start wondering, well, how do I make sense of art if it's not a sort of religious story that's been brought to life? And that's kind of a question we'll keep indulging as we move forward and start looking more at more secular subjects. And again, secular means non-religious. You might also notice she's kind of got this smirk. She's kind of amused or mildly amused at what she's looking at. And that makes you feel all the more like, oh, she's not looking at us. She's looking at something, and what's she looking at? And she's amused at that thing that she's looking at. And even the ermine is looking at it, but we can't see it. So it's almost like Da Vinci's understands the kind of psychology of like denying someone something. And I think that's a really neat thing to kind of to explore when it comes to painting, like the psychology of satisfying people, denying people. And we'll look at that as we keep moving forward. So here's a little close up. It was really wonderful. Notice the highlights, really wonderful colors, real powerful sense of kind of shading. And he took a lot of time with his work even more so, I think, than Botticelli. There's a more of, I think, a little more life to Da Vinci. Although I love Botticelli's almost kind of style. It feels somewhat more comic booky, perhaps. I don't say that in any derogatory way because I love comic books, but I like Botticelli because he isn't necessarily trying to make it true to life. But obviously, Da Vinci goes a different route, and it really shows his kind of obsession with flesh and anatomy and details and expression and that feeling. Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out, CJ. The Mona Lisa. We're of course going to get to her in a moment, but at this point, you might, well, so does this have any qualities that feel Da Vinci like? I think there's the softness of Jesus. He definitely the face, the curls, and the hand. There's something really. See, I definitely think, as someone who's looked at art for a long time, I don't think it's I can't easily dismiss the idea that Da Vinci might have painted this, but we'll get back to it, of course, in a moment. Of course, the black background. Now, what's the most famous painting of all time? I think someone just mentioned it. Well, I think probably the Mona Lisa, right? So later on, I'm going to offer an interesting theory that an artist, a famous artist, an art historian named David Hockney offers, which is that these artists might have used optics to paint pictures. And I won't bring this up today or go in depth into this today, but it's something worth considering. And when we do consider it, we'll have to go back to the Mona Lisa, because she does exhibit some of the things that tend to tend to suggest that artists are using optics, particularly the really bright face and the black backdrop, which is something that may indicate the use of lenses, mirrors, and the subject sitting in a black dark room. Basically, it's called a camera obscura, and you're using a dark room and a mirror to project the subject onto the wall, and you can trace certain details to get the accuracy. And that's something we'll talk about, I think probably next week or the following week. But certainly the Mona Lisa might be a painting that exhibits that sort of use of a subject. You have to light the subject in sunlight, or at least a bright light, but they have to be in a there has to also be, you are in a dark room. And so you have a mirror that reflects their subject onto a surface in the dark room. And I'll show you this next week when we talk about it. But what about the Mona Lisa? Well, you mentioned the smile. I think you mentioned her smirk. Yeah, she also has that smirk. So Da Vinci clearly is interested in, the smirk as kind of some element of the subject. And I think the reason why the Mona Lisa is so famous is because she has this inner world. It feels like she's someone who's thinking about something, and she's denying us access to that. We know she's looking at something, not at us, but not totally at us. She's got this, feeling on the inside. We don't know exactly what it is, but it mirrors the way her hands, that overlapping hand feels very formal and posed, but that hand underneath is she's slightly picking at her cuticle or something. It's a little more agitated than the hand on the top, which feels very posed. And so I think that contrast between the sort of mask and then the feelings underneath the mask, I mean that figuratively, of course, is really powerful and really relatable, because we all understand that we all put on a certain face for the public, but inside we're thinking something else, and we all have an inner world. I think the Mona Lisa is so captivating. One reason for that is she really feels like she's the first, like a real human being, like someone who's real. I don't know how long it took him to paint the Mona Lisa, but the subtlety and the color would definitely suggest a lot of painstaking time and understanding that in order to really bring it to life with that kind of detail, you need to take a lot of time and let it dry. Oil paint takes a long time to dry. So yeah, it very well could have. And it might also have taken him that long because Da Vinci was just, he had too many projects going on, and the Mona Lisa might have been like a labor of love that he kept going back to. And it does seem that way. He clearly put a lot of energy into it. You notice we're at eye level with her. Her eyes are lined up right up with the background there. So we are at eye level with her. And she's kind of looking away. But the other explanation for why this painting is so famous, apart from she has an inner world and all that, is perhaps if in fact Da Vinci did use any kind of camera obscura or lenses, then that means he would have traced some of the details on her face to get it accurate, the likeness accurate, and then he would have painted out the rest. And that would mean that this could in fact be the first painted photograph, right? So if an artist is painting a projection from a mirror and tracing it, well, that's the same as a photograph, only you're hand painting it rather than, burning it onto a piece of paper. And the more I look at the Mona Lisa, the more I kind of consider the idea of optics, the more I'm kind of sold on the idea that a lot of these artists might have been using this technique. And another question then, of course, as you're already probably thinking, is, well, is that cheating? And we'll discuss that on a later day, but just save this in the back of your mind for a discussion later, kind of engineering conversation about how to make art, and whether or not we can, include the Mona Lisa as a possible example of artists using projections and lenses and camera obscuras to bring the subject to life more realistically, as if they're real. There's a lot more in the picture that's very interesting. There's a kind of biographical elements at the back. You see the little bridge on the back. That's definitely a very specific place in Italy. So I think it's kind of it's sort of a selfie. That's not taken by her, but it's a picture of someone with the background adding more information about them, maybe where they're from. So it's not a religious painting, but it does have a religious quality where she feels very pious and wholesome, and there's this holy light on her. So I still feel very, very much like it's a kind of a modern painting masquerading as a religious painting. Like she's almost got like this religious quality to her. She doesn't even have eyebrows. I don't know why that is. I have never researched why that is, but maybe that was a thing. Maybe he forgot to paint eyebrows. Maybe that's why she's a muse, because or maybe he removed the eyebrows because she wasn't paying attention while he was painting her. I'm just kidding, of course. So, of course, probably the second most famous painting of all time is The Last Supper, right? And by the way, if we run out of time, we'll just pick up on Da Vinci in class next time. And the Last Supper is a very famous picture, but I think because, just look at how it compares to other versions of the Last Supper. So here's the Da Vinci version, the 1498, not long after Columbus. And if you compare his version to others, here's a version from 1308. Very kind of bizarre framing of the subjects. The perspective is a little off. The faces aren't too individualized, some to a degree, yes, but it's more the hair and the beards that make them stand out. Here's another version. This is definitely from that kind of flat Gothic era. Gotta love how they did the tablecloth down below. Here's another version. This is interesting because you see the church, the context a little better. Oh, someone mentions maybe she doesn't have eyebrows because how old it is. Yeah, that certainly could be an explanation. I'll see if I can look into that. So here's another Last Supper. And this one looks pretty nice. I gotta say that looks, crisp and naturalistic. But the framing is a little funky, maybe compared to this one and it is faded. It's been warped, probably because Da Vinci wasn't as rigorous with his, with making sure the chemistry of his painting would last forever. But I think there's something about this painting that's very compelling. What do you guys think? Why do you think this painting might be so popular and or well received by people? Definitely something to think about, right? Well, one explanation might be the real movement. And I think again, we're going to keep talking about movement because that's such an important formal tool. The movement corresponds to different individualized reactions. So instead of just sort of individualizing the face and the body, now we're also individualizing the reactions. And I think we'll look again at, and of course the religious message, and how still and confident and poised Jesus is compared to the people around him who are really freaking out and in panic mode. And I think we'll look at it again in class so we can talk about this. But I just want to go further ahead to the Salvator Mundi so we can end on that. Here's a detail of the Mona Lisa. Yeah, so here's the cracks. You can see the age, and maybe the eyebrows faded away, or he maybe removed them deliberately, but something that I'll look up and maybe I can answer later. So you notice he's doing a lot of that bright faces, dark backgrounds, not here, but certainly here and here. So there is a lot of evidence to support the idea that at least it's in the style of Da Vinci, the black backdrop, the bright face, the exquisite detail, especially on the hand. I mean, the hand, I think, is a lot more better painted or just more naturalistic than the face, which is a little blurry. But there are, I think, still elements of the face too that feel very Da Vinci-like. I'm going to argue that perhaps one of the reasons why this was maybe maybe why my Da Vinci wasn't associated with this for so long, because this painting was discovered, I think, in the last century, and someone said, "Oh, this is probably by Da Vinci," and now there's a big raging debate about whether or not this is a Da Vinci painting. And I'm going to offer a little hot take about it, which is, if you think about the church, and remember, all in this era after the Black Death, the church is trying to get people back to the church to basically recover its legitimacy, regain its authority in the aftermath of the Black Death, when everything was kind of thrown upside down. Well, perhaps the reason why this wasn't attributed to Da Vinci is because the church generally maybe wanted to didn't want this kind of depiction of Jesus to be something celebrated. And why might that be? Well, if you think about this is a great example of Jesus directly looking right at you, right? Jesus is making eye contact with you. He's looking right at you, kind of like this famous painting by Durer. And this, is arguably the first selfie ever. So kind of Da Vinci is right ahead of him only by 10 years. And it's very similar, right? You've got the bright face, the black background. And I would argue that perhaps the reason why this was kind of lost by history is because this is an example of you not needing the church. You can speak directly to Jesus without the church being an intermediary. And of course, the church doesn't want that. And so this could be a kind of Protestant Jesus, a sort of early version of Da Vinci thinking about, well, here's Jesus, a one-on-one Jesus, and you don't need the church as a kind of intermediary between you and Jesus. So just something to think about. And we'll pick up on this subject next week. Make sure you guys do your homework, your landscapes, and let me know